Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Ann Peters from the Pulitzer Center, and we'll get started here in just a few moments with our conversation for today with journalists Harriet Constable and Jacob Kushner for a conversation about their reporting project, Stopping the Next One, Scientists Race to Prevent Human Encroachment on Wildlife from Causing the Next Pandemic. That's a rather long title and a fascinating multimedia series cutting across their travels to 6 continents that I invite you to look further at on our website if you haven't already done so. I also want to say that we'll continue to focus on public health issues throughout the summer with a series of events involving other Pulitzer Center Pulitzer Center supported journalists. As we wait for more folks to join us today, please let us know in the chat where you're listening in from. For those of you who have not joined us yet, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization with the mission to elevate public engagement with underreported issues. While we're based in Washington, D.C., our staff and our work are global. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year in collaboration with news outlets around the world, bringing together this work by themes on our website, not only on the environment and public health, but on racial justice, migration, and more. We don't stop with the reporting. Our education programming spans from elementary schools to graduate degree programs and outreach to the broader public. We create opportunities to come together, such as this event today, around topics throughout the year, as well as during our annual conferences. Now, a few logistics we'd like to mention to you before we start our conversation. We'll have time for questions from the audience. You'll see a Q&A icon on your screen, so please begin adding questions there when anything comes to your mind. We'll also have a chat icon that you'll see on the screen, and that's more for technical issues. We should say that all attendees are muted, but if you cannot hear us at any time, please let us know. We also wanted to let you know that we have a recording of this session, or we will be recording the session, to then post online later in the week. One brief final logistical note, please remember to stay online once this session ends to participate in a brief survey. And we're glad to see that we have representation from Madison, Wisconsin, and from Brazil, but please keep letting us know where you're listening in from today. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Jacob Kushner writes about migration, conflict, and extremism, and he investigates foreign aid, corruption, and extrajudicial killings in East and Central Africa and the Caribbean. Originally from Milwaukee, Jacob received his undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and holds a master's in political journalism from Columbia University in New York. And I'm happy to say that both of those universities are part of the Campus Consortium Network. Jacob's journalism has appeared, among other outlets, in the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, VQR, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and many more. And several of his investigations have been supported by the Pulitzer Center. Harriet Constable is a multimedia and self-shooting producer-director based in London. She covers a wide range of topics, including the environment, politics, equality through print, radio, and video. Harriet explored the August 2017 Kenyan election through the eyes of a rollerblading subculture in Nairobi, has tracked rhinos on foot for a story about community conservation initiatives in northern Kenya, and investigated the deadly global demand for sand. Her work has been featured in numerous outlets as well, including the New York Times, BBC, The Guardian, and Financial Times, among others. Originally from London, Harriet worked at the Financial Times before moving to Africa, and previously based in Nairobi and then Johannesburg. She was a 2016-2017 board member of the Foreign Correspondents Association of East Africa. She is a graduate of Columbia University School of Journalism Summer Video Workshop in New York. And now, before we begin the conversation, we did want to provide some background in terms of a trailer that we wanted to show to provide some context. So,
75% of known newly emerging diseases that affect humans originate in animals, including COVID-19. Coronavirus is a caution of what's to come. In this series, we'll meet scientists from across the globe who are working on the next big threats to human health. We'll learn where these diseases are coming from and how they're trying to stop them. Scientists believe there are millions of zoonotic diseases out there. That's diseases that can jump from other animals to humans that we don't even know about yet.
We'll look at 3 known diseases which scientists say could cause the next pandemic: Nipah virus from bats, MERS from camels, and swine flu from pigs.
These are our scientists. They're some of the world's leading animal and human disease experts.
I can just jump in off the back of that, Anne. So, hi everyone, thanks so much for being here. As you saw, that was the start of our, this is a multimedia series, so that was the start of the video element of it, the documentary. And we wanted to take that huge topic of millions of unknown diseases, a huge proportion of them coming or being able to be spread between animals and humans, and explore that crack that open in some way that was digestible and understandable, because it's frightening and it's big, but we could see that there was a lot of work going on to understand these diseases. So we decided we would focus on 6 stories, 6 continents, 6 animals, and 6 diseases to see what's out there, what do we know already, what work is going on, and what are we doing to stop the next pandemic.
And tell us more about which diseases in particular you looked into and why those were so important to you. Jacob, perhaps.
Yeah, I can talk about a few that I looked into. Again, thanks everybody for joining. I think to start, I mean, one of the first story I looked into was actually here in Kenya, where I'm based. Basically, Kenya is the 3rd largest, has the 3rd highest population of camels in the world after Sudan and I believe Somalia. And so there turns out there's a zoonotic disease relatively recently discovered called MERS that is spread from camels. It can jump from camels to humans through the consumption of raw milk and meat. So what I did is I traveled from here in Nairobi up to Marsabit in northern Kenya to meet with camel herders as well as scientists who are monitoring and testing every day camels and herders to see if this disease is jumping over and be the first to know about it if it does. Then the next story I worked on was actually about yellow fever in Brazil. There's a team of scientists, one of whom is joining us today, I think, in Brazil's Atlantic forest who are working there to not just monitor yellow fever jumping between golden lion tamarin monkeys and potentially jumping over to humans, but also to vaccinate these monkeys, the tamarins, against yellow fever. And so we have this team of scientists there that's on the front lines trying to do biosurveillance, as well as conservation, protecting the monkeys, but with the firm belief that conservation and protecting wildlife, and in this case, those monkeys, could also make us as humans safer. And the third story that I did is about actually probably certainly the deadliest animal to humans, which is mosquitoes, or rather the parasite that mosquitoes can carry. So mosquito-borne diseases kill nearly 1 million people each year, and infect some 700 million people, so almost 1 in 10 people in the world every year. And a new breed of mosquito was discovered recently in the Caribbean, including on Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the military base there. A type of mosquito that had formerly only been found in India has appeared now in North America, in the Caribbean, and is making its way to North America. It's capable of carrying most of the bad mosquito-borne diseases, and climate change is helping it is going to help it move to a warmer climate. So those are the 3 stories that I covered, the 3 animals: camels, golden lion tamarins in Brazil, and mosquitoes, looking at that in the Caribbean and North America.
Yeah, and I looked at Asia, Europe, and Australia. So in Asia, I looked at how deforestation is causing the spillover of a disease from bats called Nipah virus. Nipah virus is on the World Health Organization's list of top 10 diseases that could cause the next pandemic. It's very deadly, it's easily spread between humans, and we're seeing more spillovers. So I wanted to work with scientists there to understand the work they're doing to surveil that disease and see what the threats are. In Europe, I looked at the intensive farming of pigs. Intensive farming broadly was a topic of interest, but pigs is where we zoned in on, and the global trade in animals and how this gives the opportunity for diseases to spread. And I looked at how influenzas are moving around these large intensive factory farmed communities of pigs. It's what European farmers described as a playground for viruses. So I looked at that in Europe, and in Australia, I looked at a neglected disease. This was interesting because it's not something you expect to hear of, a neglected disease in a country as rich and developed as Australia, but there is a disease called the Brulee Ulcer. It's a bacterial disease, and scientists believe it may be coming from possums, but there's still a lot we don't know about it yet. So digging into those three topics and the work going on to understand them and try and prevent them from causing too much of a problem in the future was the focus.
Mm-hmm. And obviously we've been focused on COVID-19 in these past months, considering it just a one-off event versus it's in terms of expecting another pandemic. If these diseases are so deadly, why aren't more of them spilling over at a greater rate?
Yeah, I think I can speak to that, which is that kind of concerningly, scientists told us actually these spillovers are happening quite a lot. And while there is some excellent surveillance and research going on, there's also a lot we still don't know. And so funding is often limited. We see elements of understanding the spillover and where it's happening, but probably not enough. And so the chances are we're giving more opportunities every day to these viruses. That's what we were being told. Human activity is creating opportunities time and time again, more and more all the time for these diseases to spill over. So they are happening, and COVID-19 is certainly not something that exists in isolation, we think.
So what are we as humans doing wrong?
Yeah, maybe I can speak to one example. There's something came up in each of our stories where it turns out that humans are really the ones exacerbating the problem for ourselves in terms of these potentially pandemic worthy zoonotic diseases. One of the first things that comes to mind is climate change, which we saw as an exacerbating factor in a lot of these stories that we did. But to speak about the one that I focused on camels here in Africa, when I traveled to northern Kenya, I discovered that camels are proliferating in number because herders who just 10, 20 years ago, mostly herded cows or goats and sheep are all turning to camels because of climate change is increasing the rate of droughts here in the Horn of Africa and in East Africa. And so the cows, goats, and sheep, they need water almost every other day to survive, whereas camels can go days, sometimes weeks without water. And so as a consequence, there are more and more and more camels, which again, kind of similar to pigs in Europe, this is a domesticated animal that people inherently have to be in touch with every day, milking the camels, herding the camels, essentially living with the camels. That increases the interaction. And specifically in terms of MERS, the virus, it's the coronavirus, and so far seems like it could be more deadly than COVID-19 from what we know. It can jump from the camels to humans by consuming raw milk, which is what herders have to do when they're out in the desert with their camels and no way to cook the milk, and also raw meat. So when a camel dies and you're out in the desert and again maybe not have time or the firewood to cook that. So that's just a way in which climate change is exacerbating the problem in terms of MERS.
Mm-hmm. And it was kind of a similar story with deforestation in Asia. So I mentioned briefly that deforestation is causing the spillover of Nipah virus. What's happening is that a few different things, but one to focus in on is that as we deforest large swathes of Asia, which is really bio-rich wild habitat, we place a lot of pressure on that habitat. This is what these scientists were explaining. And so fruit bats, which live in these rich forested regions that are cut down predominantly for livestock rearing, for palm oil plantations, and for human development generally, are their habitat is gone, so they need to find new solutions for where to live, and they might find that hanging above a market where there's humans and pigs and dogs and all different types of creatures walking underneath it, or in the turrets of something like Angkor Wat, which is usually on a normal year visited by millions of humans. So it's a problem to be pushing these creatures out of their habitat where we'd never normally be coming into contact with them, and creating novel opportunities to come into contact. But also the creature's under a lot of stress when we do that, and bats have been shown to spread and shed more virus when they're stressed. So it's a kind of double whammy situation that deforestation is causing, not only the moving of them, but the stresses that we're placing on the creature, meaning that we are coming into close contact with them, and the chances of them giving us the diseases are a lot higher anyway because of the way in which we're coming into contact with them. So deforestation and climate change, two major themes of these series that we were finding.
In addition to deforestation and climate change, what are the other ways that we are creating these conditions for pandemics that you've learned from your reporting?
So I could jump in at the start to just talk about factory farms. So the industrial farming of pigs and the global trade of pigs. Scientists were saying this is a playground for viruses, because originally, back in the day, we would have had perhaps smaller herds of pigs in maybe more green environments. The creatures themselves are under less stress. It's a less intense environment. But also, when a virus makes its way into those communities of smaller herds in more spread out, it kind of rushes through them, and then it just dies out. But when you have thousands of pigs who are all very young, they only live to be 6 months old, they are therefore vulnerable to disease. And there's so many of them, the virus can get in and then just work its virus magic over years, continually changing and adapting. And this is concerning in an isolated setting, but then you've got the story of the global trade in pigs. As you move pigs around the world for the livestock industry, a pig from China maybe meets a pig from Europe. They've got different viruses that never came into contact with one another before, and it creates an opportunity for that virus to jump over. Pigs were described as a petri dish for disease, which is kind of horrifying, but they can take in viruses from humans or birds or other pigs, mix and mingle them and spit them out in a more dangerous, into something, a more dangerous concoction, essentially. And not only do we move pigs around a lot, I mean, that was it's believed to be the root of the 2009 swine flu pandemic, was the global trade in pigs, but also there's a story of actually a sort of pandemic going on within a pandemic right now. There's a disease called African swine fever. It doesn't affect humans, thankfully, but it does indirectly affect humans, because as huge populations of pigs have died off due to African swine fever, countries need to repopulate their pig stocks. And so, for example, China has lost at least a quarter of its pig stocks in recent years. A huge number of pigs dying from African swine fever. They need to bring in more pigs to meet the demand for population. These pigs are moved around the country or the globe. Modern viruses and new viruses are mixed and mingled, and we're creating opportunities to get that step closer to the next pandemic. So the way that we eat and the way that we create our food systems is a really important part of the story as well.
And I know, go ahead.
Me actually jumping on, similar to what, Harriet said. I mean, meat and farm products, of course, and live animals are moving across the world. But I think something we don't think about often is globalization and trade as a direct factor for the spread of these diseases. And that we thought about this a little bit at the beginning of this pandemic, right, of COVID-19, when, international travel was being restricted, all sorts of travel was being restricted. And both stories, or two of the stories that I worked on were directly, the diseases were directly the result of trade and travel. So that mosquito that I mentioned that ended up in Guantanamo Bay and now is spreading across the Caribbean and toward North America, that until just a couple of years ago had only been found in Asia. But scientists believe it got to the Caribbean probably on shipping containers or possibly a cargo plane. So, you know, I mean, these could have been, you know, military, was the Guantanamo base, but lots of shipping containers with all sorts of goods that we buy every day, shipped from across the world on Amazon.com or wherever. You know, we are constantly buying things from other parts of the world. And on these things, certain mosquito species can lay eggs that can then be transported and hatch essentially in a different place. And so that's what happened in that case. And then similarly in South America, in Brazil, I mean, I did a story about yellow fever and among monkeys, primates, monkeys and humans. And, you know, yellow fever didn't exist in the Americas until the slave trade. It was Europeans who brought yellow fever to the Americas by way of taking African slaves to the Americas, where primates, both humans and monkeys, were not inoculated or we're not used to yellow fever, and so we're very susceptible to the disease. So just travel, trade, it's something we can get into a little bit more in the solutions part of this, but it's a big factor in the speed at which these diseases can spread.
And I'm glad you mentioned the solutions factor, because that's a key part of, I know, what is important to you in your reporting and probably what our audience is looking for. And you spoke with so many different scientists, and glad that Carlos Ruiz Miranda from Brazil is with us in the audience. So what work is being done to stop the next pandemic or the one after that? Tell us what you found, Harriet.
Lots of great work going on, thank goodness. So in Asia, fantastic work going on to sample bats to understand some of the footage you saw there, sampling bats to understand what viruses do they harbor. Just even knowing these kind of basic things can give us a leg up. A team in Cambodia sampling bats and monitoring how far they fly of an evening from between fruit plantations, because that can be an opportunity for transmission. Bats in these fruit plantations eating and defecating on the fruit that then gets turned into juice and slurped up the next day. So knowing where are these things spilling over is a key part of understanding how we could stop it or how we could hone in on it in the next time. And actually so many stories of wonderful collaborations. So the scientists in Cambodia would find samples of Nipah virus, but Nipah virus is such a deadly disease. It's on the World Health Organization's list of top 10 diseases that could cause the next pandemic. It's so of such concern that you can't just sample it in any lab. It has to go to a biosecurity level 5 lab, of which Cambodia doesn't have one. And so the Cambodian scientist collaborates with a scientist in Australia, and they ship or fly small samples of the virus that is found in Cambodia to scientists in Australia, and they work together to sequence the virus and understand more about it and why it's spilling over and where. And collaboration is also the story in Europe. So swine influenza is not a notifiable disease. So if farmers find it among their herds, there's no requirement to let anyone know about it. Thankfully, some very willing and collaborative farmers sharing voluntarily their samples with scientists was how they learned that there are huge numbers of swine influenza proliferating among pig farms in Europe, particularly in areas of intense pork production. Over 50% of farms, I think they found, had influenza A viruses. And with that information, they could potentially create prototype vaccines. So the more information they have, the better prepared we can be for the next one.
And on that, in terms of being better prepared, tell us a little bit about the evidence that you found in terms of the research and the surveillance. How does that help in terms of, you had mentioned the farmers aren't required to notify, but yet we have folks who are providing that information. So if you could elaborate on that, maybe Jacob.
Yeah, sure. I mean, time and again, we see the importance of surveillance. So, Brazil, when there was a yellow fever outbreak in 2016, 2017, keep in mind, yellow fever is something that has been plaguing the world for quite some time. We have a very effective yellow fever vaccine. It is largely widely available, though not to everybody in every country. the fact that we have this vaccine and we have testing and all of this makes it that, even during that outbreak, once it began, scientists were well prepared to begin, testing and trying to stop that very quickly. Same with, this mosquito that ended up in the Caribbean. Years ago, a different mosquito had actually been transported around the world the same way, called the Asian tiger mosquito. It ended up making its way to Europe and Eastern Europe and Albania on used tires. There's this global trade of old tires that you get rid of when you change the tires in your car. And they can hold water really well, and the water just doesn't go away. And mosquitoes' eggs can hatch and breed in that water. And that's how these tires were transported on a ship, ended up in a port in, I believe it was somewhere in Eastern Europe. I think it was Albania. And these, we've seen this before. And so this sort of biosurveillance, whether you know it or not, it's going on all around you. Every airport, international airport in the world has mosquito traps that catch mosquitoes, that catch other pathogen things that then get tested to see where is this coming from. So there's, between, Brazil, Kenya here, where I'm based. I mean, everywhere you look, there is biosurveillance going on, and you see time and again, the fact that we know about so many diseases, means that it's working. And one final example I'll give is there was this kind of international collaboration called the Predict program, which was working to identify emerging or new potential zoonotic diseases. And I think in the years they had been working, they identified 1,200 of new diseases, which is incredible that we hadn't known about. But they predict that there could be actually 700,000 more that we don't even know about. That's a program that was largely funded by the White House, and the last presidential administration actually canceled the funding for that important program. And so I think there's, but that the success of it, which has now been refunded, the success of that shows, what you can really do when you are funding this sort of biosurveillance that Harriet was talking about.
Yeah, and I would just add to that about the Predict program, a really direct benefit of Predict was that scientists that I spoke to in Thailand, a scientist called Dr. Supaporn, who is just a really smart, amazing woman. She was on the team that was sampling COVID-19. So given her experience, spending the last 10 years trying to understand new viruses that we don't know anything about, she was immediately called into the key lab to sample passengers coming in from China into Thailand in January 2020 to say, what is this disease? And with her training, she just quite rapidly, within days, was able to say what it was. It was faster than China. It was before China had even released any details themselves of what COVID-19 was. That will have saved lives. They could use that information to quarantine and to rapidly make decisions about how they wanted to handle that situation because they knew what it was. So a really direct and obvious benefit of something like a training program for identifying diseases in the wild.
So it's exciting to hear about the biosurveillance, the Predict program. I want to just skip, that sounds positive. What has been alarming to you? What have you found most alarming in reporting this story or this multimedia series in particular?
I mean, I could speak to that in that there was a few really simple and obvious things that we didn't seem to be doing. And I was very surprised to hear that when I was told swine influenza is a major concern among scientists, but it's not a notifiable disease. It just seems like the more information that we have, the better. So I found that quite alarming. And other really simple fixes, in Cambodia, a brilliant scientist trying to understand where Nipah virus is spilling over. It's a very concerning disease. He doesn't have funding for his next pathogen detection trip. So areas in which there's a really quick fix and it seems an obvious solution, that was where I was kind of alarmed. We weren't already doing these things, or, get this guy his funding. He has the expertise. Let's not just have him sitting there,
Yeah, I mean, just to oh, go ahead.
Please, Jacob.
Yeah, just to tack on to that. I mean, I think the question I'm sort of left with a little bit is whether, whether we, after this COVID-19 pandemic, we're still in the midst of it, of course, are we going to make some of the major overhauls that were made even after other pandemics in world history? After the Spanish flu, a century ago, cities across the world redesigned themselves in terms of, subways and trying to make more space, in terms of sanitation after cholera outbreaks across Europe and the world. There were just entire overhauls to our way of living. Massive funding for vaccines began after the Spanish flu, and so we had actually the yellow fever vaccine that I was mentioning, and that Carlos, who's joined us, is administering even to a version to monkeys in Brazil, was identified just some 15 years or so after the Spanish flu, as was the vaccine for influenza, and we have all of the kind of push for vaccines. And so I think the thing that maybe doesn't worry me, but that I wonder is, at this moment, are we going to use this as a wake-up call to start investing in the things that we know we need to invest in, whether it's biosurveillance, vaccines, these sorts of things? Are we going to invest in them the same way that our great-grandparents did a century ago?
We're starting to get some questions in from our audience, so I'm really excited about having those come in, and we'll get those answered. I do want to ask, in terms of, and putting it in terms of the biggest losers in the situation, where some of these more alarming parts of your reporting that you're seeing. One of the questions that one of our audience members said, because of key challenges during COVID and a lack of collaboration between governments, just in terms of government official leaders' perspectives. So in terms of both collaboration, what happens when we don't collaborate, and who then are the biggest losers in these situations?
I could mention one. I mean, when I traveled to northern Kenya, this county where I went, Marsabit County, is one of the poorest in Kenya in terms of income, in terms of resources, and so these herders who are so affected by climate change. Again, they're on the front lines of a virus that, so far, in terms of the MERS cases that have jumped over from animals to humans, in those cases, MERS is proven to be 10 times deadlier than COVID. It's a coronavirus, potentially 10 times deadlier than COVID, though we don't have much data on it yet. And the people on the front lines are these herders in rural areas of Africa and the Middle East and Central Asia, who have almost no carbon footprint on their own. Aside from the methane or CO2 emissions of the animals that they raise. I mean, these are people who, when have no electricity, at least the herders I met up in northern Kenya, they don't travel on planes, they don't travel in cars. I mean, their carbon footprint is close to zero, and yet they are the ones sort of being on the front lines of these pandemics. And so I think that's a real challenge, is people who, how do we get governments to invest in protecting their most marginalized citizens, when it is those most marginalized people who are normally the first affected? And I think it's a real problem.
Mm-hmm. And I think to add to that, when I think about the biggest losers from this current pandemic, I think we all feel like we've lost so much, right? Like, it's such a huge, monstrous thing to have a global pandemic happen. We've lost friends and family, jobs, economies destroyed. It's not something that we want to take lightly. It's not something that we do take lightly, and it's certainly not something that we want to give too many opportunities to in the future. So I feel like we're all feeling the kind of burden of what a global pandemic looks like now, sadly. And I think that hammers home more than ever now.
Mm-hmm. And how can we stop the next pandemic? What has your reporting revealed? What insights can you share?
Yeah, well, scientists I spoke to, the bad news is that scientists I spoke to said it's unlikely we can stop the next pandemic, because we have such a connected world with our systems and the way that everything runs with global travel. It just takes no time at all for a virus to be spread, as we saw with COVID-19, all over the globe. But what we can be is better prepared, we can absolutely influence the impact of the next pandemic. And I think that's the focus area. It's not necessarily how do we completely stop this, but what can we be doing, from creating preemptive vaccines, having something in the fridge ready to go. It took a long time to create the COVID-19 vaccinations. I mean, it was fast in context of previous vaccine creations, but a long time for a virus to be running rampant around the world. So if we were better prepared, if we had more surveillance, if we knew where the spillover could happen, was going to happen, all of these things could help us kind of jump on it faster. So it would be able to be tackled more rapidly, you would hope.
And, another thing that, in addition to vaccines and that sort of thing is, Harriet and I think we were both surprised to learn how meat consumption and industrial farming, but specifically, raising animals for meat and dairy and whatnot, how quick of a spreader it can be. The same way with pig, Harry was mentioning pigs in Europe, and swine flu, of course, we've heard of, and then also, the camels that I was discussing here, and the MERS coronavirus. I'm from the dairy state, Wisconsin, as we're known in the United States. And, there are tons of diseases that can be spread between cows. Brucellosis is one that can be spread rapidly. And there's so many diseases that we're kind of taking into our own backyard. So one, being aware of that. And two, some people would say reducing meat consumption and reforming those factory farms and that sort of thing is one thing that I think we can do, or at least look at. And another is, at least in the United States, when I think about it, until this year, this was not an issue that was really on so many of our radars politically, but there are organizations that track how our representatives in Congress vote on issues of conservation. One that I follow is called the League of Conservation Voters, and they kind of run a scorecard of how, your representatives from your state or territory voted on a certain bills and overall kind of how they're doing. So just being aware and taking that moment to write to your legislators to say, hey, what bills are you co-sponsoring to prevent the next one? It takes 10 minutes on these online forums to write your representatives, at least here in the United States, and say, hey, what bill are you co-sponsoring to fund biosurveillance, or whatever it is that you happen to be passionate about. I think it doesn't take too much effort to make that initial push for our government officials.
So in terms of other individual efforts, that was one great example in terms of having people feel they have more power and to ask those questions. So what might be another thing that one person can do, or a community might be able to do right away, right now, to follow up on this?
One obvious thing seems to be getting your COVID-19 vaccination. So much of this story turned out to be about vaccinations, trying to preemptively create vaccinations, trying to give these viruses as little opportunity as possible to create new variants. It's something we're hearing a lot about in the news at the moment. Variants potentially hampering our efforts to get out of the COVID-19 mess. And so that is a way in which we can directly, as individuals, try and address this current pandemic. And I think, to add on to what Jacob said there, certainly thinking about where our foods are coming from, where we're getting, I think it's easy to kind of say, oh, well, bats are obviously awful. Why don't we just get rid of bats? Bats are vital pollinators. Bats are crucial when it comes to, they actually help fight disease because they eat mosquitoes. So I think we need to be thinking more like, what is in my life and in my world, and how did it get here? It's not like bats in Asia have got this crazy thing, but that's not really my problem. It's actually, this is a palm oil that may have caused this deforestation. It's in some of my food. Looking at where our foods are coming from, I think that there's some kind of gray area or shady area around knowing what's in our food and where it's come from. And we can all do a little bit more to be better informed about that and make those choices of, am I prepared to accept those types of realities, I suppose.
And another one that comes to mind when, Harriet mentions, bats, or the idea that there are certain animals that are somehow responsible, and we could just, solve some of these zoonotic diseases. I mean, thinking of the researchers in Brazil who are researching monkeys, I learned from them that the more diversity in species we have of animals, the less risk we have of diseases multiplying and breaking out. So biodiversity is very important, because once a forest, like such as the Atlantic forest in Brazil, is stripped of its biodiversity, all its diverse species, then you only have a certain number, a smaller number of species carrying these diseases. And so you don't have this sort of, I think someone described it to me as kind of like deforesting a forest is akin to sort of I forget the analogy, but this idea that you can't have you can't have resilience among species, like, for example, ourselves or animal species and wild species, if you don't have enough of those species left. So that's something that I think is really important, is discussing, conservation and this idea of how to preserve wildlife and this biodiversity that actually, in a way, helps keep us safe.
Mm-hmm.
There's a goodly number of questions that I want to make sure we get to. We've got about 15, 20 minutes or so left. One question, a couple of questions in terms of quarantine, just to take us to another part of the conversation, both of humans or animals that are used as livestock, in terms of reducing or preventing disease spread. This is from Leslie. To what extent is it still important today, and what's your view, or the scientists you spoke with, on the extent to which quarantine was successful in mitigating COVID spread, or the spread of other?
Yeah, we didn't look into COVID specifically. It's obviously been around the whole time we've been reporting, and so there are those analogies. Certainly in the story of the spread of potential spread of COVID-19 in Asia, as I mentioned, the fact that they were able to understand that it was COVID-19 and understand it so rapidly before anywhere else in the world meant that they did quarantine. And when I was writing the story, Thailand had a relatively very, very minimal amount of deaths. And as I said, I didn't go into the whole story of COVID-19 in Thailand, so that would require some further research. But I think it's fair to say that was a important input into the low death rate at that time, was that they knew so much about the disease and did implement quarantine rapidly.
And, similar situation, I think, with MERS, although we've only had a few global outbreaks so far, thankfully, from camels to humans. But there was one outbreak in Saudi Arabia a few years ago, where I think the majority of the people who died in that outbreak were actually hospital workers. And so it was the camel herders who had contracted it, but when they came into the hospital, they actually spread it so quickly. And so I think hopefully this pandemic has taught a bit even more of a lesson, in addition to what we already knew, about the importance of quarantine and distancing. I mean, and MERS is a specific example because it's also a coronavirus. So it is most likely spread in very similar ways and has therefore similar ways that we can prevent it. But quarantine, if and when the next MERS outbreak occurs, quarantine, the scientists up there told me that's going to be one of the most important things to do immediately and as quickly as possible, which is why we need this biosurveillance, because if you don't have people testing camels, testing humans on a daily basis in these areas, then we're not going to know until it's too late.
Mm-hmm. A question from Carlos in terms of what do you consider in terms of certain types of pandemics that could be avoided but not others? What about the idea to reduce the risk of the deadliest diseases? Have you been able to, in your reporting and some of your insights on that, how do you prioritize the reduction of the risk of deadly diseases? Or we as communities or scientists, I should say.
I mean, I can talk to how I prioritize, or how we prioritize what stories we wrote about and thought about. I wanted to certainly from my perspective, understand what are some of the biggest threats. Nipah virus, for example, is on the World Health Organization's list. So they have a list. This is one way that they prioritize. They have a list of top 10 diseases that could cause the next pandemic. Ultimately, institutions like that have a limited set of resources, and so they have to choose which they think could be the most concerning. And they focus on things like, does it have epidemic potential? Can it be easily spread? How deadly is it? Do we have a vaccination? Those all go into the decision of how concerning this virus is and whether it makes it onto the priority list. And so that, for me, was a clear area of interest. I don't think that's super widely known. And diseases in which scientists were concerned, I asked the scientists, what keeps you up at night? What do you worry about? And Nipah virus was what they said in Asia. And I think the level of kind of deadly diseases that bats can harbor ordinarily without any issue to themselves or others, but in the circumstances in which we're creating, quite problematic. They talked about Nipah virus being right up there with their most concerning sleepless nights. And similar for the swine and influenza story. It's a much bigger story. Could have easily done a story on bird flu very concerning as well. So it was a case in terms of the project of honing in on, well, we're only going to pick one per place. What's going to speak to these? What are scientists telling us are most concerning, and why, and how are they prioritizing it, and focusing on that for the series.
Yeah, and just to jump onto that, I mean, there is a lot of debate among scientists about how to use the resources that exist and how to direct them. I mean, some scientists, like the predict sort of method of, there are most likely hundreds of thousands of, potential viruses and other pathogens out there that could, that we don't know about. Let's just try to discover as many as we can and learn about them. Some scientists say that's the wrong way, and actually that, the vast majority of those are not going to ever jump over to humans or ever negatively affect humans, or if so, in very minor ways. And so therefore we should be really focusing on either A, ones we already know about, or B, ones that are very similar variants and similar ones to ones we already know about. So there is a lot of debate there. Yeah, just wanted to kind of add that in, that there's no consensus exactly on how to use those resources.
Right. And was that challenging in terms of your reporting, or what were some of the challenges you came across?
I think that for me, some of the biggest challenges were just trying to get this story done in such complex times. Obviously, when we originally pitched this story, it was right when certainly the UK or the world really was going into lockdown in around March or April 2020. We still had really no idea how long this would last, exactly what we were up against. And so, somewhat naively, I thought that we would be going to all these places physically, and I would be doing like I do all my other stories, and I'd go and take my camera and follow these scientists around and see how they worked. And it didn't exactly work out like that. I would continually book travel and have, a new lockdown would come in there, and you try and shift your focus. And so that's where, the creativity and encouragement of our BBC editors and support from the Pulitzer Center was actually really helpful with some of these major challenges, which turned into great opportunities, because took some creativity to figure out how we're going to do these stories best, and also got to work with a great network of journalists all over the world. But it did throw up a lot. It took a long time, a lot of backwards and forwards to just get them in the first place, I think.
Yeah, and I can say, speaking of the story in Brazil, in the Atlantic forest of Brazil, about yellow fever among golden lion tamarin monkeys. I mean, it was just incredible. I was hoping to travel and do the reporting myself, as I normally do, but when that became impossible, Brazil at the time, actually, we were doing this, had the second highest COVID rate after the United States, and but this team of scientists just, I have to say, they did so much to do live videos with us from the field, to do prep, to talk us through in the field what they were doing at this moment. So it felt as if we were being there, showing us what they were seeing. It really was kind of opened my eyes to the fact that you don't always have to jump on a plane or whatever, or a boat to go, report a story that, especially, these scientists who can do so many things that are so well educated and trained and in the field every day. It was impressive how much we could get by them kind of acting really as citizen journalists on some parts of these projects in terms of helping us that way. And so, yeah, I mean, it was, I think, journalists have to play right now more so than ever a really crucial role, as in response to Carlos's question, in transitioning, I think, now from all the attention we're paying to one disease, COVID-19, and which is still going on, and we need to be paying attention to it. But we need to, especially in media environments such as the United States, or places where people are getting vaccinated, rates seem to be going down. Can we transition this attention to stopping the next one? And I think that's the thing that journalists are well placed to, latch on to this sort of idea and use now. Now is the moment when we're focused on pandemics and pandemic, preparedness. Before we all forget and move on to the next thing, can we, as journalists, be pitching stories, be pitching projects to transition our thinking into focusing on what we can do to stop the next one?
Yeah, and that is exactly one of the questions from our audience as well, is the role of journalists who are in a unique position to keep this conversation going. From your perspectives, I'll just jump off of that one to say, what are the stories that you didn't cover in this series and that you want to going forward? And if you have 20 stories, maybe give us the top 2.
One thing that I would love to look into as a result of this is the way in which development, so that we've looked quite a lot at food, and we've looked quite a lot at kind of deforestation, and that is tending to be a bit more from livestock and palm oil and things, as I've mentioned, but I'm going to forget the exact details of this now, but there is, it's interesting the way in which developments can potentially create disease or cause opportunities for disease. And that's certainly something I would like to look into. So there was a study done, I think it was like the 70s in South America, when a new railway, or I'm forgetting the details, but a new piece of infrastructure was going in for human use. And there was a study alongside of it to monitor what the disease spillovers were as a direct result of a particular piece of infrastructure being built. And I think that it's a great specific way to explore this story, because I think it is such a big topic, overwhelming and frightening, and a way to say these particular individuals are focusing on this particular train line, and these are the diseases that are spilling over from it. These are good ways to help us understand and kind of comprehend something as big as millions of diseases that we don't know about.
Yeah, I think one of we covered it in our series, but I guess where my interests lie in terms of additional stories are really looking at livestock production and meat in the dairy industry, because again, I just didn't realize, I think we want to think of far off places, or bats, or wet markets and these sort of things as being responsible, or as being the major risks. But actually, I mean, if you look at the close quarters to which animals in factory farms around the world, like everywhere, are the close quarters they're being held in, and the way these different diseases can break out to humans. I think that's probably what interests me in terms of going forward, is looking more into that, and not necessarily in the food supply, but really just the production of these animals from places like Kenya to Wisconsin in the dairy industry. And yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of that's where I might try to go next with this.
And in terms of this, also the global movement of both people and animals, our audience has asked, given what you've talked about and this efforts at biosurveillance, can we do more to curtail in terms of the spread of pandemics, in terms of that global movement?
I think there's some really great examples, people leading countries and individuals leading by example of saying we're working together. The farmers in Europe, there's no requirement for them to provide information to scientists right across Europe about their pigs, but they are doing that. They see the benefit in that. Collaborations, like I've mentioned, between Asia and Australia, leading by example of saying, we're going to share this information. We're going to tell, Thailand, the scientists in Thailand sharing that information with the world about COVID-19. Fundamental, so important to get that information out there as quickly as possible. So there's been some great examples of global first thinking. This is a problem that affects us all, and therefore we must all work together to solve this. And it would, I think we would all agree, it'd be great to see some more of that.
And that reminds me, I think one of the panelists mentioned, brought a question about it, about the One Health approach, this idea of, we need to stop treating our well-being as if, every disease is in its own category, and now we have to focus on this health problem or that health problem. We're ignoring the fact that all of this is interrelated, and our actions, even directly, our travel, our trade, when we get on a plane, when we order something that is delivered to our continent on a ship, to just the way different ecosystems are affected by human input. I think that's something. It's a complex idea that I don't think is as easy and is inherently as easy to latch onto as what's the disease we need to pay attention to. But I hope that we as journalists can help scientists who are using this approach kind of convey the importance of it better to our audiences.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We just have really 5 minutes to go. So I wanted to ask you a final question in terms of what are the thoughts you'd want to leave our audience with today?
Yeah, I think Jacob kind of touched on my key takeaway from all of this, which is perhaps the biggest factor, it seems, from the theme that we've been gathering from speaking to all these different people on all these different continents, all these experts and people on the front lines, is that we need a bit of a shift in thinking, and Jacob's just touched on that, but seeing a rich and healthy biosphere not as something that's kind of in the way of our progress and development, but actually a fundamental buffer to protect us, to keep us healthy and to keep everything else healthy, and seeing our fates as interconnected with the fates of other animals and our environment. I think with that kind of shift in thinking, we really could get to a place where we could start preventing pandemics, and that's what we were hearing. And I think that kind of was the biggest takeaway for me from this whole thing. And that's certainly what I'd want people to consider going forward.
Yeah, and I mean, our series focused on, of course, the risks and the potential next pandemic-worthy diseases or dangerous diseases. But what we didn't cover were all the successes in this series necessarily. I mean, there was, I think it was in 2017 in Kenya, a mobile phone data collection system allowed people in one part of Kenya who started noticing a disease among buffalo in a conservancy to alert the country that there was something weird going on. And it turned out there was anthrax among these buffalo, and actually prevented just by, I think, an SMS-based system, prevented a potential outbreak of anthrax in Kenya. And now the program is being spread nationally to make it more robust. So I mean, there's so many examples of how this biosurveillance works that I'm actually very optimistic. I think one of the reactions I got to the series, to the articles, was, oh wow, this is so scary. It is, but talking with the scientists who we interviewed for these stories, you can't. I don't think any of us feel pessimistic leaving that. I think you just feel so optimistic that there are such smart people who are working on these issues, who are passionate about them, out in the field now, and really all they need are the resources and the public policy support to do their research and to keep us safe. So that's how I'm left feeling optimistic about our chances.
Well, thank you. I like your optimism, and I really appreciate that, and appreciate your time, Jacob and Harriet. Just want to thank you for such an important conversation today, and to let our audience know too that the recording of this conversation will be online at pulitzercenter.org in the coming days. So we really hope that you'll share widely, especially in terms of what you can do and the optimism that Jacob has left us with. And thanks to my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center as well, especially to Holly Peipenberg, who is the producer for our session today. And want to let everyone know in the audience that we are a nonprofit journalism and education organization. So we hope you will help support our mission and become a Pulitzer Center champion if you have the means to do that. We also wanted to let you know about some upcoming events we have. As I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be focusing throughout the summer with other Pulitzer Center supported journalists looking at other public health issues, as well as justice issues, and a full gambit of what the Pulitzer Center supports in the way of reporting projects. One of our events is next week in collaboration with the MacArthur Foundation and the University of California at Berkeley in terms of the somewhat positive impact of COVID reporting in terms of greater collaboration between journalists and media organizations. And in June, among our events, we'll have the End of Isolation Tour launch, which connects with playwright Sarah Shord and the box, which she wrote as a focus on solitary confinement. And so we hope you will join us as well for our event on June 8th. In the meantime, we hope you will stay for a few more moments to take a survey, and we wish you a good day. Thank you again for joining us.